Have you ever heard the saying that every action has a consequence? Well, I'm living that proof right now. My name is Victoria. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 10 years of my life, I've played the most dangerous game there is. I used the man I claimed to love to build an empire. When I met Richard, he was just another guy with potential. Fresh out of business school, wealthy family, connections worth their weight in gold. I was a Chicago waitress trying to survive, without a college degree, without prospects, with nothing but ambition burning in my chest. I saw in him my chance to escape that life, and I seized it with all my might. I transformed myself into the perfect woman for him. I learned to speak like the people in his circle spoke, to dress like they dressed, to act like they acted. I seized Richard not only with my body, but with intelligence, with calculated charm, with every word chosen to make him believe I was the love of his life. It worked better than I expected. 3 years later, we were married. 5 years later, I was the wife of the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in Illinois. I had everything. The mansion in Lake Forest, the designer clothes, the imported car, the social recognition. I built my own consulting firm using his connections. I became rich, powerful, respected, but there was a little problem. Richard found out. He found out that our marriage was a lie from the beginning. He discovered every manipulation, every strategy, every calculated moment, and now he wants revenge. Not the simple kind of revenge, like divorce or a fight over money. No, he wants something much worse. He wants to expose who I really am to the whole world. And the worst part, he has proof of everything. Let me go back to the beginning of this whole story. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where you quickly learn that nobody gives you anything for free. My mother was a cleaning lady. My father had abandoned us when I was 5. We were poor, the kind of poverty where you're ashamed to invite friends over. I swore to myself I wouldn't live like that forever. I started working at 15. I was a babysitter, a supermarket cashier, a shop assistant. At 18, I got a partial scholarship to study marketing at a community college, but I had to drop out in my second year because I couldn't afford the rest. That's when I started working as a waitress in a fancy restaurant in downtown Chicago. And that's where I discovered the world of the rich. I saw businessmen closing multi-million-dollar deals while I served $1,000 a bottle wine. I saw women covered in jewelry, talking about trips to Europe as if they were about to board a bus. And I wanted that. Desperately. It was on one of those days that Richard walked into the restaurant. He was 27, having just taken a director position at his father's company. I was with some friends, celebrating something. He was handsome, confident. He had that air of someone who was born, knowing the world was his. I was 23 years old and knew exactly what to do. I was the most attentive waitress he'd ever had. I smiled at the right time, asked the right questions, showed genuine interest. At the end of the night, he asked for my number. And that's where the biggest lie of my life began. A lie that would last 10 years and transform me into someone I no longer recognize. Before I continue telling you how I built my castle of lies and how it's all crumbling now, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to know if there are people from Chicago here, or if you're following me from another city in the United States or anywhere in the world. Comment below, I'll read them all. And if you're enjoying this story, leave a like to help me continue bringing you these accounts. Now get ready, because what comes next is stump. The first few months with Richard were pure theater on my part. I researched everything about him. I stalked all his social media, read interviews his father had given, found out what his hobbies were, his tastes, even his favorite authors. Then I transformed myself into the woman of his dreams. Did he like art? I started going to museums and learning about Impressionism. Did he like wine? I took an online course on Did he like intelligent and independent women? I re-enrolled in college, this time paying out of my own pocket, working 2 jobs. Every date was carefully planned. I knew exactly when to be vulnerable, when to be strong, when to agree, and when to challenge his opinions. Richard fell madly in love. 3 months after our first date, he told me he had never met anyone like me. 6 months later, he took me to meet his family. His mother, Patricia, was one of those wealthy matriarchs who analyze every detail. She looked me up and down when we met, assessing my thrift store outfit that I had spent weeks searching for to look discreet, yet elegant. I made a point of being polite, but not subservient. I talked about my studies, my career plans, how much I valued financial independence. I saw the exact moment she decided I was good enough for her son. Richard was over the moon. He told everyone he'd found a real woman, that she wasn't interested in his money, that she loved him for who he was. The irony of it made me laugh alone in the shower. A year later, he proposed. It was romantic, elaborate, in an expensive restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. I cried. Real tears. But they weren't tears of love, they were tears of relief. My plan had worked. The wedding was spectacular. 200 guests, in a historic mansion on the outskirts of Chicago. Everything the finest and most expensive you could imagine. I was 25 years old and marrying into money. A future. Everything I'd ever wanted. Richard's mother insisted on paying for my dress. We went to an exclusive boutique where the dresses cost more than my mother earned in a year. I chose the most expensive one. Because I could. During the ceremony, I looked at Richard saying his vows, with those eyes full of genuine love, and I felt a pang of something. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was more of a recognition that he truly loved me, and I was using that, but I pushed the feeling away. I focused on my goals. The honeymoon was in Italy. 3 weeks traveling through Rome, Florence, Venice. Richard wanted to show me the world, and I let him, but I was already planning my next steps. When we returned, I started working at his father's company. Not just any position, but as a special assistant to the CEO. People thought it was nepotism, and it was, but I made sure I was competent enough that no one could openly complain. I learned quickly. I observed everything, everyone. I learned how businesses worked, who the important players were, where the real money was. I befriended the right wives, attended the right events, built my network like a spider's web. 3 years after the wedding, I launched my own consulting firm. Digital marketing and brand strategy for technology companies. I used every contact Richard had given me. Every door his last name opened, I walked through. And my company exploded. In 2 years, it was making millions. I was officially successful. And nobody suspected a thing. Richard was a good husband, I must admit. Attentive, caring, he supported me in everything. When my company started to grow, he was my biggest fan. He celebrated every contract I closed, every milestone I reached. He truly believed we were a team. And in a way, we were. But he didn't know that I saw our marriage as a business partnership, not as love. Gradually, I began to change. The more successful I became, the less I needed to pretend. I started going out alone more often. Business trips that lasted weeks. Dinners with clients where I'd come home late. Richard never complained. He trusted me completely. What an idiot. I started having affairs. Nothing serious, just fun. Men I met at conferences, executives from other cities, someone interesting in a hotel bar. I had power now, my own money, and I wanted to experience everything I'd missed out on by getting married so young. I felt invincible. His company was also growing. His father had retired, and Richard had taken over as CEO. Under his leadership, the company tripled in size. He was stressed, working 12, 14 hours a day. We barely saw each other. And I was okay with that. It meant less time having to pretend. We had a routine. Business dinners together twice a week, social events on weekends, mandatory vacations twice a year. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple, successful, beautiful, powerful. The reality was that we were two strangers sharing a mansion. But it worked. Until one day, Richard started acting strangely. He came home earlier, paid more attention to me, asked questions about my day. At first, I found it annoying. Then, I realized something was wrong. He knew something. It was a Thursday, I remember perfectly. I arrived home from a business trip to Boston, tired, wanting only to shower and sleep. Richard was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, with a briefcase in his hand. Not a laptop, not a cell phone. A physical briefcase, full of papers. My stomach churned. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment, the kind that hurts more than any scream. I sat in the armchair opposite him. He placed the briefcase on the coffee table between us. Then he began to speak. He said that for the past 6 months he had hired a private investigator. Not because he suspected the affairs he had known about those for over a year, but because something had always seemed wrong in our relationship. From the beginning, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The investigator had found everything. Every lie I had told about my past. He discovered that I had obsessively researched Richard before our second date. He found old messages I had sent to a friend, describing my plan to marry a rich man. I had records of my trips to places I knew Richard frequented, even before we officially met. I even had a recording of a drunken conversation I had in a bar 5 years ago, where I told a stranger that I had manipulated my way into a life of luxury. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of everything: photos, transcripts, documents. Irrefutable proof that our entire marriage was a sham. That I had calculated every step. That I never truly loved him. I tried to speak, but he raised his hand. He said he didn't want apologies. He just wanted me to know that he knew. And then he dropped the bomb. Richard said he had 2 options for me. Option 1, immediate, scandalous, and public divorce. He would expose everything the investigator had found. Sue my company for being built on fraudulently obtained connections. And make sure my name was so tarnished that I would never work in Chicago again. Option 2, I would stay married to him. But on his terms. I would be the perfect wife, present, attentive, faithful. I would attend charity dinners, social events, everything expected of a CEO's wife. In exchange, he would keep my secret. No one would ever know who I really was. My company would remain intact, my reputation preserved, but my freedom, gone. I was in shock. I was sure he would file for divorce, fight over the money, try to destroy me, but no, he wanted to keep me. Like a broken trophy you glue back together and put on the shelf. I asked why. Why didn't he just get rid of me? He smiled, but it was a sad, bitter smile. He said the irony was that despite everything, despite every lie, every manipulation, he still loved me. Or loved who he thought I was. And that part of him wanted to believe that somewhere, beneath all the layers of falsehood, there was a real person who could learn to truly love him. That scared me more than any threat. Because it meant he was much more complicated than I thought. I asked for time to think. He gave me 24 hours. And he spent the night in the guest room. I stayed up all night, weighing my options. The truth is, I had no choice. Everything I had built would be destroyed if he made it public. My company, my reputation, everything would turn to dust. The next day, I accepted option 2. The first few months under the new arrangement were strange. Richard set clear rules. I had to be home for dinner 4 nights a week. Weekends were for us. No work, no excuses. All business trips needed his approval first. And all my social media, email, and cell phone passwords had to be shared with him. It was suffocating. But I complied. Because the alternative was losing everything. Strangely, the more time I spent actually present at the wedding, the more I began to see the real Richard. Not as a means to an end, not as the rich guy I had used, but as a person. He was funny. He had a dry sense of humor I had never noticed before. He was intelligent in a way that went beyond business. He liked astronomy, ancient history, philosophy. He had a vulnerability he hid from the world, but which he began to show me on those forced dinner nights. And against all logic, I began to like him. Not love, not yet, but something akin to genuine affection. That scared me more than anything because it meant that maybe Richard was right. Maybe somewhere inside, there was a person capable of real feelings. My company continued to function, but I was less involved. I delegated more, trusted my team. And I realized that being in control of every detail wasn't so necessary after all. The world didn't fall apart because I was working less. In fact, my team flourished. 6 months passed like this. Richard and I developed a new routine. It was still strange, there was still tension, but it was different, less hostile. More like 2 prisoners learning to live together in the same cell. Until everything changed again. It was Richard who changed things. One night, after dinner, he called me into his office. My heart raced. I thought it was the end, that he had decided to expose me no matter what. But that wasn't it. He showed me a new project, a charitable foundation he wanted to create. Focused on education for young people from underprivileged communities, scholarships, mentoring, training programs, and he wanted me to manage it. I was confused. Why? Why entrust something so important to me? He said he had thought a lot about my story. That, yes, I had lied, manipulated, used him, but that I had done all that because I was desperate to escape poverty. That he had had every opportunity handed to him on a silver platter, and I had to fight for every crumb. It didn't justify what I did, he said, but it explained it. And he wanted to give me a chance to use all that ambition and intelligence for something good. Something that would really make a difference. That broke me. For the first time in years, I truly cried in front of him. Not calculated tears, but genuine tears. The kind that come from a deep place you didn't even know existed. I accepted the leadership of the foundation. And in the following months, I threw myself into the project. I visited public schools in Chicago, talked to hundreds of young people who reminded me of who I was at their age. Desperate for a chance, for an opportunity, for someone who believed in them. I structured programs, hired educators, established partnerships with universities. And for the first time in my life, I felt I was doing something that mattered. Not to increase my bank account or my social status, but to truly change lives. It was addictive. More so than closing any business deal had been. Over the next year, something fundamental changed between Richard and me. The walls that existed between us began to crumble. Not all at once, but brick by brick. We started to truly talk. About our childhoods, our fears, our dreams. I told him things I had never told anyone. About the nights my mother cried because she didn't have money for food. About the shame I felt when other children laughed at my second-hand clothes. About how I developed this armor of falsehood because I thought the real person I was would never be enough. Richard also opened up. He talked about the pressure of growing up as the son of a successful man. About how he always felt he needed to prove his worth. About the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only cared about his money and status. About how, when he met me, he thought he had finally found someone real. And how the discovery of the truth had destroyed something fundamental in him. We realized that, despite coming from completely different worlds, we were both trapped in prisons of our own making. Me, in mine, of lies and manipulation. He was full of expectations and pressures. And strangely, this mutual recognition created a connection we'd never had before. We started doing real things together. Not obligatory social events, but simple things, walks in the park, cooking together on Sundays, series marathons on the couch, the things normal couples do. And I started to feel something I never thought I'd feel. I started to fall in love with him. For real this time, not for the money, not for the connections, but for who he was as a person. And that terrified me. Falling in love with Richard was the most confusing thing that ever happened to me. Because I didn't know if it was real love or just another layer of manipulation. Was I convincing myself I loved him to make the situation more bearable? Or were these genuine feelings growing inside me for the first time? I sought therapy. Something I should have done a long time ago. The therapist, Dr. Sandra Martinez, didn't judge me when I told the whole story. She just listened. And then she asked questions that forced me to look at myself in a way I had always avoided. She made me realize that the person I had become, the calculating manipulator, was armor I wore because I thought the poor girl from Chicago would never be accepted in the world I wanted to be a part of. That I had internalized the message that my value lay in being useful, in being desirable, in being anything but myself. And that perhaps, for the first time, I was discovering who Victoria really was. Not the desperate waitress. Not the calculating wife. Not the ambitious businesswoman. But a complex, flawed person, capable of both terrible and good things. Richard and I started couples therapy too. It was his idea. Weekly sessions where we finally talked about everything. About betrayal, about hurt feelings, about what we wanted for the future. Couples therapist, Dr. James Chen, established that if we were to stay together, we needed to rebuild from scratch. Create a new relationship, based on truth, not on the lies of the past. It would take time. It would take effort. And there was no guarantee it would work. But for the first time, we were both willing to try. Really. Not because Richard was forcing me, but because we both wanted to. 2 years have passed since that night Richard confronted me with the folder of evidence. The foundation he created, which I now manage, is 3 years old and has already helped over 500 young people with scholarships. 52 of them have gone on to university. It's my greatest pride. My consulting firm still exists, but I sold half of it to my partner. I no longer desperately need the money. And I've discovered that having time for other things, for people, for causes that matter, is more valuable. Richard and I are doing well. Not perfect, but well. There are days when I still feel the weight of what I did. There are moments when I look at him and see the shadow of bitterness in his eyes. But there are other moments, increasingly frequent, when we look at each other and I see something real. Something built not on fantasies or manipulations, but on a conscious choice to be together. I reconnected with my mother. She lives with us now, in the guest house on the property. Richard insisted. She's older, more frail, and deserves comfort after a lifetime of hard work. Seeing her happy, without worrying about money, without working to exhaustion, makes it all worthwhile. I ask myself sometimes, do I regret it? The initial lie, the manipulation, using Richard, yes, absolutely. If I could go back, would I do things differently? Honestly, I don't know. Because that desperate 23-year-old girl saw no other options. And the journey, however twisted and wrong it may have been, brought me here. To this version of myself that is finally learning to be real. To this imperfect but honest relationship. To this job that makes a difference. Richard sometimes jokes that he tamed me. But it's not quite like that. He gave me something I never had. A safe place to take off my armor. But the story doesn't end there. Because the past is never buried forever. 3 months ago, I received a call from an unknown number. It was a journalist, Samantha Cole, from the Chicago Tribune. She was investigating a story about women who use marriage as a means of social mobility. She had heard rumors about me. She wanted an interview. My blood ran cold. I hung up on her, but she called again, and again. Sent emails, LinkedIn messages. She wasn't going to give up. I told Richard. I expected him to be furious, to think I had leaked something, that I had somehow provoked it. But he remained calm. He said he knew this would happen, eventually. That secrets of this magnitude never stay hidden forever. And that we needed to decide together how to handle it. We had 3 options. Ignore it and hope she wouldn't find enough evidence to publish. Sue for defamation preemptively. Or the most radical. Tell the story ourselves. On our terms. The third option terrified me. It meant exposing everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every horrible thing I did. It meant everyone would know. My clients, the parents of the young people in the foundation, our friends, the entire Chicago society. Richard argued that if we were the ones telling the story, we could control the narrative. We could show not only the mistakes but also the journey of redemption. We could transform something shameful into something educational. But the decision, he said, was mine. He would support me in any choice. I spent 2 weeks thinking. I talked to my therapist, my mother, my business partner. Everyone had different opinions. But in the end, the decision had to be mine. And I decided to tell. Everything. Because hiding had consumed me for 10 years. And I was tired of lying. We contacted the journalist. We scheduled a long 6-hour interview where I told her absolutely everything. Richard was by my side the whole time, holding my hand when it got difficult. The journalist, Samantha, was visibly shocked at times. But also impressed, I think, by the brutal honesty. When we finished, she said she needed to verify some facts, talk to other people, but that she would publish it in 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were pure agony. I didn't sleep properly a single night. I rehearsed 1,000 times in my head how people would react. I imagined the judgment, the rejection, the hatred. Richard remained firm. He said it didn't matter what people thought, that he really knew me now, and that was what mattered. The story came out on a Monday morning. It was the front page. A long, detailed article, with photos of me and Richard. The title, From Waitress to Con Artist, The True Story of Victoria Ashford. I spent the whole morning without the courage to read it. Finally, Richard read it aloud to me. The journalist had been fair. She exposed all my mistakes without sparing any details. But she also talked about the foundation, about the change, about how Richard and I had rebuilt our marriage on real foundations. She included testimonials from young people the foundation had helped. She included my therapist's opinion on growth and change. It wasn't an article that painted me as a heroine. But it also didn't paint me as a one-dimensional monster. It was complicated. Like real people are. The reactions started immediately. My phone exploded. Social media went up in flames. And as I expected, they were brutal. I was called everything. Con artist, manipulator, unscrupulous, self-serving. Some people asked for the foundation to be shut down, that I shouldn't have contact with young people. But there were also different reactions. Among the hateful comments, different messages began to appear. Women who had done similar things. Who had married for financial security instead of love. Who saw themselves in my story. Some thanked me for being honest. Others shared their own journeys of change. Young people from the foundation publicly defended me. They said I had changed their lives, that, regardless of my past, the work I was doing now was real and important. That made me cry more than any negative comment. But the hardest part wasn't the strangers on the internet. It was looking into the eyes of people I knew. The first time I returned to my company's office, the silence was deafening. My partner, Jennifer, struck up a private conversation. She said she was processing everything. That she felt betrayed because our friendship had started through Richard, but that she also recognized my work and dedication over the past few years. She asked for time. I respected that. Social events became strange. Some friends simply disappeared. Others looked at me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and judgment. The wives of other CEOs, who used to include me in lunches and parties, now kept their distance. I was a reputational risk. Patricia, Richard's mother, was especially difficult. She called me 2 days after the story came out. She said she always knew there was something wrong with me, that her maternal instinct had detected it. She said terrible things. That I was a gold digger, that I had destroyed her son's life, that she would never forgive me. Richard tried to intervene, but she hung up. That hurt more than I expected. Because part of me knew she was right. I had deceived her family. I had lied to all of them. A month after the publication, the foundation faced its biggest crisis. 3 of our largest donors canceled their funding. They claimed they didn't want their companies associated with someone with my reputation. We lost almost 40% of our annual budget. I thought I would have to close. That all the good work we had done would be destroyed because of my past. I was devastated. I seriously considered resigning, letting someone else take over so the foundation could survive. But something unexpected happened. The young people the foundation had helped organized an online campaign. They created a movement called Everyone Deserves a Second Chance. They told their stories. They talked about how mistakes don't define a person forever. How change is possible. How I had made a real difference in their lives, regardless of what I had done in the past. The campaign went viral. And from unexpected places, new donors began to emerge. Small donations from hundreds of people. Not the rich who had funded us before, but ordinary people who believed in the foundation's mission and the possibility of redemption. In 2 months, we not only recovered the lost budget, but exceeded it. The foundation grew, and it changed. It wasn't just about education anymore. It was about second chances. About how complex people are, how mistakes don't mean the end, how we all deserve the opportunity to be better. We expanded the program to include mentoring for people leaving the prison system, for women leaving abusive relationships, for anyone trying to rebuild their life after past mistakes. And the work became even more meaningful. Richard was proud. He said that what I had done was transform a crisis into an opportunity to make an even bigger difference. That this was the Victoria he knew existed beneath all the masks. 6 months after the article, I received an unexpected invitation. A university at Northwestern wanted me to give a lecture to psychology students about ethics, manipulation, and change. I was shocked. Why would a prestigious university want to give a platform to someone like me? The program coordinator explained that students need to understand how manipulation works in real life, that books and theories are important, but real case studies are invaluable, and that my journey of change was equally important to discuss. I accepted. Nervous, but I accepted. On the day of the lecture, the auditorium was packed. 200 students, some professors, even some journalists. I went up on stage with trembling hands. I started telling everything. From the beginning, the poverty, the despair, the decision to manipulate my way to a better life. I explained my tactics. How I researched Richard, how I molded my personality to be what he wanted, how each interaction was calculated. I saw some students furiously taking notes, others looking on in horror, some with fascination. Then I talked about the consequences, about living 10 years in a lie, about the emptiness of building something on false foundations, about how I discovered too late that I had sacrificed my humanity for material things, and finally, about change, about how forced confrontation with the truth had been the best thing that ever happened to me, about therapy, about honesty, about rebuilding relationships and identity from scratch. When I finished, there was silence. Then, applause. Not enthusiastic, but respectful. During the question and answer session, a student raised his hand. He asked, "Do you think you've really changed, or have you just learned to be better at pretending?" The student's question hit me like a punch. Because it was the same question I asked myself every day. I took a deep breath and answered truthfully. He said he wasn't 100% sure. That self-awareness is complicated, that after years of manipulation, it's hard to trust your own feelings. But that he had indicators. The constant therapy. The fantasy of having chosen public exposure instead of continuing to hide. The work at the foundation that continued even when no one was watching. The relationship with Richard that was difficult and uncomfortable, but real. And that perhaps he would never be absolutely certain, but that he woke up every day choosing to try to be authentic. Choosing honesty even when it was easier to lie. The student nodded, satisfied with the answer. Other questions followed. About how Richard managed to forgive me. About whether I thought I had paid for my mistakes. About whether I regretted speaking publicly. I answered them all with as much honesty as possible. After the lecture, several students approached. Some to criticize, some to share their own experiences with manipulation, whether as victims or perpetrators. One young woman in particular caught my attention. She had tears in her eyes. She said she grew up poor like me, that she was in university on a scholarship, and that every day she felt pressured to be someone she wasn't in order to fit in. That my story made her realize she had a choice. That she didn't need to sacrifice her authenticity to succeed. I hugged her. And in that moment, I felt that maybe, just maybe, all the pain and humiliation of exposing my truth had been worth it if it prevented one person from making the same mistakes I had made. The lecture opened unexpected doors. Other universities started inviting me. Companies wanted me to speak about ethics in business and authenticity in leadership. I became a speaker on topics I never imagined. I wasn't a celebrity. I was more like a living example of someone who had made a terrible mistake and was trying to fix it. And that resonated with people. Richard and I developed a new dynamic. He started attending some lectures with me. He told his side of the story. How he discovered the betrayal. How he decided to give a second chance. How the rebuilding process went. His vulnerability touched people even more than my confession. Because he was the victim who chose forgiveness instead of revenge. Our relationship became stronger than ever. Not despite the exposure, but because of it. There were no more secrets. There were no more masks. We were just two imperfect people trying to build something real. Patricia, Richard's mother, eventually reached out again. It took more than a year, but she called asking to talk. It was a difficult meeting. She was still hurt, she still didn't completely trust me, but she recognized that I was trying to change. She said that for the sake of her son, she was willing to give it a chance. We weren't as close as before, maybe we never would be, but there was mutual respect. My consulting firm partially recovered. I lost many clients after the exposure, but I gained others. Companies that valued authenticity and vulnerable leadership. It wasn't the billion-dollar company it had been, but it was sustainable. And I cared less about revenue and more about the kind of work I was doing. I had a sense of purpose I'd never had before. 2 years after the public exposure, Richard proposed to me. Again, it seems ridiculous. We were already married, but he said he wanted to do it right this time. He wanted a fresh start, with honest vows, with a commitment based on truth. The ceremony was small. Just close family and real friends. Not business contacts, not the Chicago social elite, but the people who stayed when everything fell apart. My mother, some colleagues from the foundation, Jennifer, my partner, who eventually decided to continue our partnership, the young people the foundation had helped. Patricia was there, reserved but present. I wrote my own vows. For the first time, I promised things I truly felt. I promised honesty even when it was difficult. I promised real presence, not performance. I promised to work every day to be worthy of the forgiveness he gave me. I promised to love him not for what he could give me, but for who he was. Richard also made his vows. He promised to continue challenging me to be better. He promised continuous forgiveness, because change is a process, not an event. He promised to build a future where we could both be completely ourselves. We cried, both of us. From relief, from gratitude, from hope. It was the most real moment of my life. There was no jazz band, no hundreds of guests, no $20,000 dress. But it was infinitely more meaningful than the spectacular farce of my first wedding. After the ceremony, we did something different. Instead of a traditional honeymoon, we spent 2 weeks volunteering on an educational project in an underprivileged area of South Chicago. We painted schools, set up a library, mentored young people. It was tiring, dirty, unglamorous, and it was perfect. Today, 3 years after the exhibition, my life is unrecognizable compared to what it was. I no longer have the mansion in Lake Forest. We sold it and bought something smaller, more modest, more like a home than a showroom. I no longer have the imported car. I drive a regular sedan. I no longer wear designer clothes. I shop at regular stores. And you know what? I'm happier than I ever was when I had all that. The foundation is now my main occupation. My consulting firm has become secondary. We've helped over 1,000 young people so far. 23 have earned university degrees. 12 have started their own businesses. Countless have changed their trajectories. I continue to give lectures regularly. I've spoken at over 50 universities, dozens of companies, and conferences on ethical leadership. I always end with the same message: your mistakes don't define you, but your choices after your mistakes do. Richard and I are considering adoption. We've discovered that I can't have biological children, but instead of seeing it as a tragedy, we see it as an opportunity. There are so many children in need of loving homes. It would make sense for our story to give a child the chance my mother gave me, but with more resources. My therapist, whom I still see weekly, says I've made immense progress. That the Victoria of today is fundamentally different from the Victoria of 10 years ago. I ask if she thinks I've really changed or just better at deceiving myself. She smiles and says that the question itself is evidence of change. That the old Victoria would never question her motivations. My mother is happy, healthy, well cared for. Sometimes I look at her and think about everything I've done, all the lies I've told, and I wonder if in the end it was all worth it. I don't have an easy answer. Part of me believes that the ends never justify the means. That manipulating and deceiving Richard was wrong, period, no matter what came after. Another part recognizes that if I hadn't made those choices, I wouldn't be here. My mother would still be working herself to exhaustion. I would still be a waitress with no prospects. The foundation wouldn't exist. Hundreds of young people wouldn't have had the opportunities they had. But that doesn't make my actions right. It just makes the consequences complex. I've learned that people aren't good or bad. We're all shades of gray, capable of both cruelty and compassion. And that real growth comes from confronting the parts of ourselves we don't like. Richard gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me: consequences without destruction. He could have ruined me. He had every right. Instead, he created a path where I could face my mistakes and become a better person. That requires a kind of love and strength that few people have. I still have bad days. Days when I wake up and shame consumes me. Days when I read online comments about myself and want to disappear. There are days when I wonder if I'll ever be more than the woman who cheated on her rich husband. But I also have good days. Days when a young man we helped calls me to tell me he got accepted into his dream university. Days when Richard looks at me and I see genuine love reflected back. Days when I look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. And these days, more and more, outweigh the bad ones. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness for everything I've done, but I'm working every day to deserve it. And that was my story of how I used someone to climb the social ladder and how it almost destroyed everything. But also how I found redemption in a way I never imagined. Comment what you thought and don't forget to like. And stay tuned for the next story coming soon. See you later.